There is some talk about WikiLeaks having been defeated by banks controlling their finances. When talking about resources by nations, by corporate holdings, bank cartels, and supranational organizations, most people are labeled as falling into paranoia and conspiracy theorists. How far do these supranational organizations have the power to influence policies of one or more countries? And in following after that, there is a question. Julian Assange recently announced on October 24th that they need $3.5 million to continue with the WikiLeaks platform. Do you think that this platform would be able to survive with PayPal, Visa, MasterCard, and Bank of America blockading them from their resources? And is WikiLeaks really necessary in the current economical and political times that we're in? Would you agree that or what would you comment on with regard to their participation as a catalyzer for the Arab Spring, or would that have happened in either scenario?
Well, several questions there. As for the power of supranational institutions, I mean, that can be denied only by somebody who's purposely blind. I mean, you don't have to go to WikiLeaks. Take the World Trade Organization and the whole array of social and economic and political programs that institutes and pretty much forces most countries to adopt. I mean, where's that come from? You know, it's a collection of multinational corporations and the very few states that cater to their interests. They pretty much dictate the principles, the rules. You know, I think the BBC was probably exaggerating when they called it a de facto world government. But there's something to it, of course. In fact, if you look at there was just a detailed study that came out by Swiss Research Institute of
analysis. Yeah.
Well, okay, that was interesting. I mean, they found, you know, that of looking at about 50,000 corporations, that there was a nexus of about 150, which were tightly connected. In fact, they all were mutually owned. Ownership was very tight. I think about half of them were banks, financial institutions. And they controlled a huge amount of the global economy. And of course they interact and they have plans and so on. So you don't have to go to WikiLeaks to find a concentration of power and authority. And in particular countries, the same thing. Now in the WikiLeaks case, it's very significant because what's happening is that, you know, essentially the internet, which was created as a free, open structure of democratic interchange, is now beginning to succumb in a dramatic way to the concentration of power of a very small number of interlinked institutions. Remember, the internet actually developed right here, a lot of it right now, where we're sitting. And it was originally developed just as a means of communication among scientists. And it was completely open. In fact, it was under state control for about, I guess, roughly 35 years. Actually, it was under control of the Pentagon. And as long as it was under control of the Pentagon, it was hardly free. So, for example, I had a daughter in Nicaragua during the 80s, during the Contra War. And it was just practically a war with Nicaragua. We couldn't write letters, we couldn't telephone, but we could communicate over the ARPANET, the Pentagon network. She had access to it there, I had access here. Then it later turned into the internet, and in 1995 it was privatized, roughly then, and nobody knows exactly how. But so there are modes of controlling it now through portals, and WikiLeaks shows another way of controlling things, and that's dangerous. That could undermine this is all taxpayer created by the public, intended to be free and open, and it was pretty much when it was under Pentagon control. then National Science Foundation controlled. Now there's a serious problem about net freedom and a lot of activism about it and proper concern. Well, what's happening to WikiLeaks shows one way in which state power, in this case U.S. power, has induced or compelled various groups to block access to information they don't want people to have. That's dangerous. As for WikiLeaks itself, it's a public service. People in a democratic society, people want to know what their governments are up to. There's some things maybe should be kept secret, but I've spent a lot of time over the years studying secret documents that they get declassified. There's almost never anything security related in them, except the security of the state from its citizens. Mm-hmm. They don't want people to know what they're up to. But it's you look at them, first of all, reading them, most extremely boring, but you find nuggets that tell you about what's going on.
Mostly objectionable material to the public.
But they don't want the public to know. They don't want the public to know what they're up to. Well, that's natural, Don't expect a corporation to tell its workforce what they're doing. They rarely do. So a power system will try to protect itself, but to the extent that you have a democratic society, they shouldn't be allowed to do it. And I think the material that WikiLeaks has been providing does help us understand something about the way the governments function. There haven't been really, there have been important revelations. Whether they contributed to the Arab Spring, I kind of doubt, though there were some. So, for example, there was a leak from Tunisia, the Tunis embassy, to Washington a couple of years ago, informing Washington that Tunisia, contrary to pretenses, was not a democratic, advancing society. It was a dictatorship. Everybody hated the ruling family. There was a lot of brutality. In fact, it was describing pretty accurately what it was like. I don't think Tunisians had to be told that by a leak from the embassy, but it's useful for us to know that Washington was perfectly well aware of what was going on while it was claiming the opposite and acting in support of the dictatorship. In the case of Tunisia, it's even more important with regard to France, because France is sort of the imperial overlord. And there are others like that. So, for example, the Honduras embassy, after Zelaya was kicked out by a military coup, the Honduras embassy and U.S. embassy in Honduras produced a careful study showing that the coup was unconstitutional. It was throwing out a democratic government. And they got it pretty straight. Well, we now know that went to Washington. The U.S. hesitated at first to kind of ambiguously supported opposed the coup regime, but then it moved towards support for it. It broke from most of Europe and most of Latin America in supporting the military coup, with all kind of nice talk about how everything's going to go fine. But it's good to know that they knew the opposite. That's useful. We should know that about our government. We should know at the time, look, this is what our government is supporting a military coup, and they know it's a military coup, and they're pretending the opposite. We should know that. Yeah. And there are other things that were very significant, like, for example, maybe the most significant revelations were from the embassy in Pakistan. And Patterson, the ambassador, and she was sending cables back to the United States. She supported U.S. activities in Afghanistan and Pakistan. She wasn't criticizing them. But she was pointing out that what the U.S. is doing in Afghanistan and Pakistan is deeply hated by, she's in Pakistan, by Pakistani society, is leading to enormous hostility in Pakistan for good reasons. You bomb people, force them into fighting your war, which they don't approve. Of course, it's going to create hostility. And she reported that, and she even warned that carries with it an implicit threat that it might lead to nuclear weapons drifting into the hands of jihadis. Well, I think Americans should know that their government is acting in ways which increase the probability that nuclear weapons will go off in New York. That's a good thing for Americans to know that. And in fact, the press won't report it, but if you take a look at the assassination of bin Laden, just think about it for a minute. It's amazing that this hasn't been discussed. The commando team that went into Pakistan, illegally of course, and infuriating Pakistanis and the Pakistani government and army, naturally. The team that went in was under orders to fight their way out if they had to. Well, suppose they had to fight their way out. It would have come into conflict with the Pakistani army, which is a professional army, deeply committed to the sovereignty of defending the sovereignty of Pakistan. The commandos wouldn't have been left on their own. They'd at least have gotten air cover. They might have gotten ground cover. We could pretty soon be at war with Pakistan. Well, Pakistan is the most rapidly growing nuclear power in the world. The nuclear system is laced with thousands of people working there, many of them from the small but existing radical Islamist groups, many of them connected to jihadis. In fact, this Obama operation significantly increased the probability that there'd be nuclear weapons going off in London and New York. Well, people should know that. Actually, the press should be reporting it. It's sort of obvious when you think about it for a minute. But if you can get it from WikiLeaks, they should know that too. And in general, I don't think anyone's detected any thing that was a serious secret that was leaked out. Maybe something, I can't find anything. Mostly it was things that people ought to know. In fact, with regard to the Middle East, it was quite interesting. One of the WikiLeaks exposures that got the most attention and a lot of euphoric headlines were the ones from Saudi Arabia saying that the king supports, and the ruling dictatorship supports U.S. policy towards Iran. Says we should cut off the head of the monster and so on. Now, that was headlines all over the place. Arabs support U.S. policy towards Iran. Well, that's kind of important. And it's a very interesting reaction. The reaction demonstrates the almost passionate hatred for democracy on the part of the government and the intellectual classes and the media. Because though they don't like to report it, they know perfectly well from U.S.-run polls that our public opinion is very strongly opposed to U.S. policy. So take, say, Egypt. According to U.S.-run polls at the same time, about 90% of the population regarded the U.S. and Israel as the main threats to Egypt. About 80% opposed U.S. policy so strongly that they thought the region would be better off if Iran had nuclear weapons. And maybe 10% thought of Iran as a threat. So that's headlines. Arab supports U.S. on Iran, meaning the dictators do. And what do we care about anybody else? As long as everything's under control, the guys with the guns and the clubs that can keep things down, then we're perfectly happy. That's our concept of democracy. The media, the intellectual classes, the government, and so on. Well, WikiLeaks didn't say that, but if you put the information together and you think about it for 5 minutes, that's what you see. And that's worth knowing too. It's worth having further information that elites are petrified of democracy. Of course they hate it. Fancy talk about democracy promotion, but can't possibly believe it. And that's worth knowing. And WikiLeaks helped on that indirectly. So you can see why the government would want to shut them down. They're producing information which is embarrassing to state power. They don't want to be the same dislike of democracy would want to prevent that. Well, the question is, do they have the power to compel what are theoretically private organizations to close down a free mode of interchange that was created by taxpayer funding? Can they close it down to shut something that they don't like? Now, as for the funding of WikiLeaks, you know, again, it's not a matter of speculation. The popular movements can make up that funding if they're organized and willing to do it.